Hi everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be a worst to best books that I've read so far this year. I guess first disclaimer, ignore anything that a cat does in this video because they're probably going to be wandering around trying to get out, doing all sorts. Second disclaimer, apologies for the lighting in this video. I've already tried to film this once today, but for some reason the sun just keeps coming in and out like constantly. So I realised that there's quite a lot of books that I've read this year that I've just never talked about on this channel. I thought I would just do a video where I talked about the worst to the best books I've read this year so that we're all fully aware of where I'm up to. Let's just get straight into the worst books. I say worst, it's more like the books that I've enjoyed the least. Let's just go with the least favourite book of this year so far, and that is The Witnesses Are Gone by Joel Lane. This one I'm quite sad about because I really love the cover of this book and I did buy it full price mainly because of that. This is a horror novella which is basically about a guy who looks in his shed one day, I think, and he finds some like weird bootleg film which is a little bit like weird, disturbing, and it's by some French director, and all of his films are just like very obscure, people can't really find them, and our main guy decides that he's gonna like travel the world to find more films by this guy. I feel like I just didn't really get it, like it was a bit too artsy for me, it was a bit too like fever dream like, and I'm starting to realise that I just don't like fever dream books that are just confusing to be confusing. I didn't care about the characters, I didn't care about this director, I just didn't like it. I considered putting it down multiple times even though it's teeny tiny. By the end I just thought I should have just never picked this up. The next three in this list are all translated fiction, which I think is kind of weird because I do gravitate towards those. First one was Tamush by Sven Holm. So this is a novella about a post-apocalyptic future, or I don't actually know when this is meant to be set, but basically a nuclear attack has happened. A load of people who had a lot of money basically paid to live in this hotel after the nuclear attack. There's staff there, they're being waited on. People start turning up at the front of this hotel who just want help because they're basically stranded. I thought this was going to be a very interesting like moral look at this situation and just how people behave when they're in that like survival mode. It just didn't give me what I wanted it to give. The writing style didn't work for me. I remember having to read sentences over and over again because they just weren't going in my head. I found parts of it to be kind of unrealistic. I don't know whether it's just because I'm more cynical when I think about how humans behave. I just thought a lot of this was very like flat, nothing really happened. I just again didn't care. The next one might be a little bit controversial, but it's The Invention of Morel by Adolfo Bioy Cesaris, I think is how you would say his name. I think this one is seen as a bit of a classic. It's been described as like a perfect plot for a novella, so I did go into it with quite high hopes, but for me I just didn't really enjoy it. It's basically about a fugitive who is living on an abandoned like isolated island, and then one day he notices a group of people that don't seem to be able to see him, or they're not interacting with him, and it's just kind of like a mystery, kind of a pining for romance. It was just one of those books that couldn't keep my attention whatsoever. I don't really like books where somebody just like instantly falls in love. It's not romantic to me at all, and I just didn't like our main character for that. The amount of times that I thought I should just put this down, but I was waiting for that like big moment. The idea of this book was really good, but for me the execution of it just didn't work. And then next up we have Lemon by Kwon Yo Sun, and this is a book about a girl whose sister was murdered, but rather than focusing on like the murder itself or the mystery of who did it, this book is looking at a few different women in this girl's life and how they're sort of dealing with it. And at first I was really enjoying this book. It has an interesting format because some of it is told in like a one-sided conversation with a therapist. Another part of it was written as like a reenactment of a police interview, but what she is imagining was happening. It was interesting in that sense, but then I just felt a bit like underwhelmed. And then I was reading reviews, and one girl basically said about this like twist or reveal that came at the end, I just completely did not comprehend that this happened at all. Like it just completely skimmed over me, and I was like, oh yeah, maybe the writing was actually not for me if I didn't like understand this like big final moment. So yeah, I ended up bumping it down to a 2-star just because of that. Next up we have The Ugly Truth by Elsie North. So this is a mystery book which is told in different forms of mixed media. It's basically about this woman who is like a celebrity. She disappears. A few different videos of her start coming to light where she's like asking for help. You're trying to figure out like what happened with her, but it's also just very kind of obvious. But it did keep me interested because of the way it was told. I listened to this on audio, but I do remember feeling like it was very, very similar to sort of the Britney Spears story. So I found that a little bit icky. And then next up we have my first non-fiction of this list. So I don't tend to rate non-fiction, but just for this list I've done it in terms of how much I enjoyed it and how much I learned from it. So the first one is Cultish by Amanda Montell. So in this book she's basically looking at how the language and the techniques used by different famous cults are kind of similar to some of the groups and clubs that go on nowadays. So multi-level marketing schemes, gym groups like CrossFit, Peloton, that kind of thing. This was an interesting idea and I quite liked the start of this book, but I did find it a little bit surface level, a little bit too long for what it was trying to say. It was also focused on like strictly America, focused on groups that you need a lot of money to be able to join them, you need a lot of time, just basically being quite privileged, but then it didn't really talk much about that. We also got quite a few like personal stories from the author herself, but I just wasn't super interested in that side of it. I kind of wanted it to be more textbooky style. Next up is another novella. I don't know what's going on with me in novellas this year. I usually love them. This one is The Employees by Olga Ravn, I think. This is basically set in the 22nd century. It's a bunch of transcripts from different employees that work on this. I think it was like a spaceship. There's a mixture of humans and also like humanoids, so like part robot, part human. And it's basically just them working with like loads of random objects and how they feel about the objects, how they interact with each other. This one was a very weird reading experience because I did DNF it at one point and then I went back to it and finished it. I highlighted so much of this book. Other parts of it I found so hard to just read. The information was not going into my brain. The amount of times that I just lost interest in a sentence and just like didn't understand anything. I don't know. I thought it was an interesting format to tell a story in, but I just felt like there wasn't enough going on to like keep me interested. Next up we have Mrs. March by Virginia Fato. This is about a woman who lives the perfect life, or seemingly a perfect life. She's got this famous author for a husband, and then one day Mrs. March goes to the bakery. Basically somebody at the bakery makes a comment about how Mrs. March inspired her husband's latest book character, but this book character is not meant to be a very attractive person, and it kind of just sends her into a bit of a spiral. For me, this could have been a novella. I feel like a lot of it I've not really remembered. Sometimes these like women going unhinged books, that in itself isn't really enough to keep me interested. The next book on this list is Magma. This is written by an Icelandic author. I will put her name on the screen. It's basically from the perspective of a girl who is in a relationship with this very toxic, horrible boy. I think I would have liked this a bit more had I not just read In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, which I will mention later on in this video, but I couldn't help comparing the two because they are very similar in like themes and in the way that they're written. With Magma, I felt like we were only ever really seeing this relationship at the bad times, and it just ended up feeling kind of frustrating to read because you just don't want her to be with this guy. So I didn't really feel the same emotions, which is a shame because I feel like if I'd have read that first, I probably would have enjoyed both of them quite a lot. This one is Milk Blood Heat by Dantiel W. Moni. This is a collection of short stories that are all kind of focused on different interpersonal relationships, mainly to do with women. I gave this like a 3 overall because some of the stories I liked, whereas a lot of them I thought were just like okay, like they didn't really do much for me, and I don't really have the desire to sort of read more from this author or reread this or anything like that. I've now had to open the door because the cats were like scrapping on either side, so if you hear any more noise, it's probably them. The next book that I have to talk about is Bathhouse by PJ Vernon. So this one is a mystery thriller. In this book, we're following quite a lot of different gay male characters. Our main character is in a serious relationship with another man, but one day he goes to a bathhouse because he's looking for some you know, extra fun. But he ends up having this really horrible encounter with somebody. It all kind of spirals from there because he feels like he can't tell his partner what really happened. It seems that this guy who he had this encounter with is coming to get him, and it is like a fun book. I listened to this entirely on audio. I enjoyed the kind of gossipy feel of this book. It had a lot of like juicy drama. I didn't really think much about it afterwards. Nothing really like overly surprised me, and some of the tropes towards the end just aren't my favourite. The next book that I have here is Just Another Missing Person by Gillian McAllister. This is a missing person story where our main character is a, I think, detective inspector or something. So she's basically given this missing person case. However, she's also being blackmailed by some unknown person to basically sabotage this case, or something about her personal life will be revealed. This one was quite fun to read at the time. It reminded me a lot of Line of Duty because we're looking at corrupt police officers and what you would do in that situation. It did have a couple of decent twists in here that I thought should have landed a bit better. Like, they very much aligned with what I love in a twist, but it left me feeling a little bit confused with the timelines and stuff. So it had a lot of like good elements in there, but as a whole it just didn't sort of work fully for me. But yeah, I did enjoy reading it at the time. Next up we have another missing person book, and this one is Unmissing by Minka Kent. Well, I say that it's about a missing person. It's kind of about a missing person who is now found. So in this book we're following two different women. One of them is the first wife of this guy who went missing quite a long time ago, and then we're also following his current wife. At the very start of this book, our first wife basically turns up at her husband's front door and says like, I'm here, I've been found. Our current wife is just like very shocked by this, and it's about navigating what to do moving forward, but also like what really happened with the first missing wife. Why has she just been like found? Why has she not gone to the police? There was one twist in this book which really shocked me. I loved it, but then the kind of subsequent twists were not as good for me. By the ending I was just like, oh, this is just a bit of a silly book, isn't it? But I had overall a good time with it. The next one is Good Neighbours by Sarah Langan. I think listed on Goodreads as a horror, but it's kind of like literary. It's basically about this like neighbourhood drama. This sinkhole has appeared in the park, and then there is this tragic accident involving the sinkhole where somebody in the neighbourhood gets blamed for it. It's such an interesting like social horror kind of book where you're looking at how easy it is to manipulate others to sort of buy into a story, how awful like mob mentality is. It does go quite dark at some points. I can't really remember now what stopped me from loving this book. I think it was because it was quite a unique writing style that I just wasn't fully like in love with. But yeah, it did have a lot of like really good elements, and it did feel very unique and interesting. The next book on this list is my second non-fiction, and this one is Britney Spears' memoir. I listened to this on audio. I think it is ghostwritten, but it was definitely very, very interesting to hear about what's been going on in her life, about the pressures of being famous, the conservatorship. But I do think it lacked some of the emotional sort of depth that I was looking for. Ever since I read Jeanette McCurdy's memoir, I don't feel like any book is going to kind of reach that like level for me. It's only a very short book. It talks a lot about celebrity culture, and it was just like a fun time. Next up we have a very chunky book. This is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. You would think that with the amount of tabs and things that I put in here I would love this a little bit more, but this ended up being like a 3.5 for me in the end. This is a very complex book that I'm not going to try and attempt to summarize here because it just takes way too long. I did do quite a full review in one of my last videos, so I will link that there just if you need a bit more context. I guess in essence, the amount of hours that I put into this book reading it twice compared to my enjoyment and overall like experience with it just didn't really match. Can I appreciate the level of effort that went into this? Yes. Do I think that it is as amazing as some people say it is? No. Next up is Glass by Ellen Hopkins. So this one is the sequel to the book Crank, which I read quite a few years ago. It is basically about this girl who gets addicted to crystal meth, and it's written in free verse poetry, I think. I remember just loving the first book. I gave that one 5 stars. This one was more of like a 3.5 for me. It's just a very sad book because all she really cares about in this book is the drugs and the men in her life. It just didn't really have the same sort of magic for me as the first one did. I wasn't as sympathetic towards our main character in the second one. They are very YA, and I feel like I've grown up a lot since I read the first one, and I'm just not really interested in that writing style anymore. But I do think these books are very important to read if you are like a young person and you want to see that other perspective and try and understand addiction and how it affects people and their families, then I do think that it's very valuable. But for me personally, I feel like I've grown up from the series. I've learnt a lot from it. I value what it's trying to do. Next up we have There Is No Anti-Memetics Division by, I'm going to say Quantum, QNTM. I feel like it's kind of hard for me to explain because I didn't fully understand it myself. It's about this secret kind of agency. This agency basically studies anti-memes, which are things that exist in our world that we cannot see, and the second that we learn about them, a lot of the time it's a really bad thing for us. One of the things in this book is like a giant spider with like huge legs that just lives on our world, but we never see it. And it's basically written in like not chronological order from different people who work in this agency dealing with these things. I feel like I'm saying it really badly, but I enjoyed lots about this book, but it didn't fully work for me because I have never heard of this as an idea before. But it turns out that this is something that is kind of well known on the internet. It was kind of hard for me to understand, but I have just started playing a game called Control. I feel like it reminds me a lot of that, and now that I'm playing this, I appreciate this book a lot more because it kind of is making a bit more sense to me now. There was lots about this book that I really enjoyed. There were lots of really scary scenes, but I think it wasn't the best introduction to this idea for me personally. Next up on the list we have Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr. So this is a short story collection. I think it was his debut. These very messed up, disturbing stories. All of them are based in Brooklyn and they're all following different characters that are, as the back of the book describes, dope addicts, hoodlums, prostitutes, workers and thieves. This book was very disturbing, very dark, very like visceral, gritty. For some reason I really love these American stories that are just filled with gross, grotesque characters and just like very depraved. I don't know why I like it so much, but I do. There were a couple of stories in here that literally broke my heart so bad, left me like hollowed out, numb, disgusted in myself for just reading that, disgusted in this author for like putting that on paper. I just love his writing style. Something about it just draws me in straight away. It reads very like colloquially, is that the word, where he makes up his own like rules for grammar, spelling, punctuation. But yeah, just be warned that it is very nasty. Now that I'm looking at the rest of this list, I'm wondering if this should be a little bit higher. It probably should, but let's just ignore that for now. The next one that I have here is Kill for Me, Kill for You by Steve Kavanagh. It's kind of based on that strangers on a train trope where we've got two people who basically want to kill somebody, but in order to avoid being caught for this, they both agree to kill each other's person. This one was super fun. It was very fast paced, very exciting. There was a distinct scene that I remember where somebody's like sneaking around a house and it just gave me that like classic thriller feel where I was like completely hooked. I was on the edge of my seat. I don't remember a ton else other than that, but I just remember having like the most fun reading it. And I think I was ill as well, and that proper like just invigorated me. Yeah, it's probably one of the best thrillers that I've read this year. The next one is another thriller. So this one is The Good Lie by A.R. Torre. We're following this woman who is a psychiatrist, I think, or psychologist, who specialises in violent offenders, violent people. And then we've got this guy who is a lawyer who agrees to defend a suspected serial killer who is on trial for murdering the lawyer's son. So this lawyer is defending his son's supposed killer, and he basically enlists our psychologist lady to do a profile to help him defend this guy because he doesn't think it's him. And this one was really fun. It has a bit of a romance thing in it which didn't like grossly offend me, which a lot of them do. I just would rather they get deleted from the book. It was just like interesting, and the twist, like the reveal at the end, was really good. I didn't see it coming. It was very dark. Definitely one that I would recommend if you're into the like legal psychological side of thrillers. Next up we have Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This one you've probably all either read it, watched it, heard of it before, but it's basically about a band. It's written kind of like a documentary style, interview transcripts with the different members of the band. It's kind of similar to Fleetwood Mac where they're all in relationships. It's all very messy, especially between our main guy Billy, our main gal Daisy Jones, and then Billy's wife Camilla. That was like my favourite thing about this book. There were some like really good conversations towards the end that I was like, oh yes, we just needed that. It talks a lot about addiction and the lifestyle that comes with being like a rock and roll band. And yeah, it was just super, super interesting. Next up, we've got a more recent horror release, and this is Knock Knock Open Wide by Neil Sharpson. We start with this woman who's travelling to somewhere in Ireland. On her way home, she comes across this dead body, so she goes somewhere for some help, and then horror ensues. Then we're also following like an alternative timeline where we're following two girls who are at university. Both of them are quite interested in this like long running TV show which has this puppet in it that is never seen, so it's kept in like a box, and there's some weird like haunted vibes around it, and all these stories kind of link in together. I really love the writing in this book. The start was like super horrifying, gory. I thought this was going to be like 5-star, and even though it drastically changes tone when we're following the two girls at uni, I still was like super interested in that side of the story as well. It just felt very unique. I will definitely be reading whatever this guy publishes next. Next up, we've got another non-fiction, and this is Written in Bone by Sue Black. Basically, Sue Black is a dame and she's a professor. She's a very accomplished woman, and she's written this book which basically explains how much we can learn about a person purely from their bones. She's investigated different murder cases, missing person cases, where all she has to work with is bones, and it's about how she identifies them, all the different things that she can tell from like tiny fragments of bones, and how she's used that knowledge to like solve cases and help the police. So interesting. I loved learning about Sue Black's like personal life as well, like all her stories, things that she's done. I just completely was in love with it. Next book, You Should Have Left by Daniel Kelman. I'm so confused by this book because loads of people give this like a 1-star, a 2-star, and I don't get it. Like, I actually do not understand, because I gave this a 4. I loved it. It's a very short novella, basically about this guy who's a writer. He's staying in this house with his family. We get to see his diary, but also his screenplay that he's writing for this new film. And things are just a little bit off, like in his writing. And then he starts seeing things that are part of this house that weren't there before. I just thought the writing was really interesting. I liked the atmosphere. I liked the tone of it. The only thing that I didn't love 100% was the ending, but I just maybe wanted it to be a little bit bigger than it was. But other than that, I have really nothing bad to say about it. Next up, we have Elena Knows by Claudia Pinero. This is translated from, I think, Spanish by, let's have a look, Frances Riddle. This is about an older woman who has Parkinson's disease, and we're basically following a day in her life as she's trying to solve the mystery of her daughter's death. Most of this book is about Elena as a character. It's about her relationship with her daughter. It's about how she's struggling to cope with her illness and her Parkinson's, and just how difficult it is to live with that kind of illness. I just loved this book. It felt like expertly written in a way. The way that it links all these different themes together was just so well done. It touches a lot on bodily autonomy in terms of this illness, and how her autonomy and how her ability to move her body how she wants to has been taken away. But then it also takes this idea of bodily freedom and talks about abortions, talks about suicide. There's a lot of like religious undertones in this book. It feels very feminist. I will definitely be looking for more books by this author. I know that she writes quite a lot of like detective books, and although this does have like a mystery to it, it doesn't really rely on that mystery much. It looks at lots of different other things whilst having this mystery is like what keeps the plot moving forward. And yeah, I just friggin' loved it. It was really, really good. Next up is another short story collection, and this is Out There by Kate Folk. I really want to buy this one physically because the pink and purple in the cover, I just love it, and I really want to reread this book. These short stories are like horror, sci-fi, very like Black Mirror feel to them. There were quite a few that were related to like houses and homes and body, weird shit. The writing style just really worked for me. All the ideas were super interesting. There wasn't one that I didn't like. And yeah, like I say, I would really love to reread them, and I will definitely be looking for more of Kate Folk's books. We're now at the like 4.5-star up books. To be fair, when I'm looking at this, I'm like, wow, I've actually had quite a good reading year because a lot of these I've read quite recently. First up, we have The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. So this one is a thriller which is basically set at an isolated writing retreat. Two of our girlies on this writing retreat used to be best friends, and there's something that's gone on between them that we don't fully know yet. And they've both been invited on this retreat with their favourite author. They don't want to say no, but they know it's going to be a bit awkward with the other one being there. This one was just fun. I was interested the whole time, and it felt like a bit silly, a bit campy. The twists were really fun. The actual like atmosphere was good because you're in this like wintry, isolated setting. It was just one of those books that I really didn't want to put down. I listened to it constantly. I was like listening to it on my walk from my car to work. When I had no headphones, I was just blasting it in the street like, oh my god, I need to like listen to what's going on. I have seen mixed reviews. I feel like people either love it or they hate it, so luckily I fell on the love it side of this one. The next book is another non-fiction, and it's Natives by Akala. I'd never heard of Akala before reading this book, but he's like a musician. He's also very active in like political spaces. It's just like the perfect argument to go against any racist person in Britain. In our schools in Britain, you do not learn about the empire at all. I feel like you just constantly learn about World War II, Nazi Germany, over and over again. So there's these like huge parts of history that we're not traditionally taught in schools, and you have to like learn that kind of thing for yourself. He's just such an intelligent guy, and the way that he presents his arguments, he's very engaging, and he just breaks everything down in the most accessible way. It was just a fabulous book. Next up, we have one of my 5-star predictions for this year, which was like a 4.5. But it was Any Man by Amber Tamblyn. I loved this book so much. I knew I would. It is basically about a unknown female serial rapist who goes by the name of Maud, but she's like unidentified, and we're basically following a bunch of men who have been violently attacked by this woman. It talks a lot about like the shame that they feel, the pressure that they feel, the bullying and the harassment that they get from members of the public. I just loved the way that this book was written because some of it is poetry, which I'll admit I'm not a massive fan of poetry, and some of it did go over my head a little bit, but other bits of it are told in like diary entries, social media posts, transcripts, things like that. This book was incredibly close to being a 5-star, but I think the only reasons that I didn't give it that 5-star, firstly, some of the poetry just didn't resonate with me, and I did think that the ending wasn't as strong as I wanted it to be, but it barely even mattered because this book is just so unique, so interesting and eye-opening, and I loved how it flipped the script a little bit and looked at it from this different perspective. It just has a lot to say in not very many words, and I will definitely be rereading this at some point, and I would highly recommend it if you are in the right headspace to read something like this, because it's very upsetting and sometimes it does feel like a punch to the gut, so just keep that in mind. Next up, we are moving into, I think I gave this 4.75 stars, which is kind of pathetic. This is The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu, I think is how you say his name. This was translated from Chinese by Ken Liu, and this is like a hard sci-fi. So this book starts in the 60s, where this young girl witnesses her dad be beat to death by Red Guards during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And then 4 decades later, we're following this other guy who's basically asked to try and infiltrate this group. As part of his mission to do this, he comes across this game called The Three-Body Problem. It's like a full VR experience game, and this game is like very mysterious, but you always end up in this place and some really drastic like weather happens, kills off the entire civilization. The aim of the game is to try and like make that not happen. But then behind all of that, we've also got the idea that everything we know about science is not the case anymore. Loads of scientists have been found dead. Oh, it's just hard to explain, but it's friggin' amazing. I just loved it. I loved the writing. I was hooked. I loved all of the ideas in this book. It was so interesting, and the thought of being in this world is terrifying. The idea that scientists could one day realise that a lot of the like laws of the universe that have just been taken for granted are not actually true was something that just like really frightened me. The game itself was so interesting. I looked forward to those scenes all the time, finding out what this new civilization was, what was going to happen next. Again, scary. It's not a horror or anything like that, but the ideas in this just felt so like real and terrifying. The only reason I didn't give it 5 stars is because it didn't feel like a perfect book for me. But it was damn close, and I'm hoping to read the next one very soon. Okay, so we've now reached the top 5. So these are my 5-star books of the year so far. The first one is The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. It is the sequel to The Poppy War, which I think I gave 4.5 stars. I can't really tell you much about the plot because it's a sequel, but the Poppy War trilogy is a fantasy series based a lot on Chinese history and mythology. Our main character in these books is called Rin, and right at the start she gets accepted into this like prestigious military academy, and then very quickly we enter this war situation. So in this one we're following Rin not long after the first book finishes. This one really builds on the magic system. I felt like I massively understood it more. I just love Rin. She's such like a fiery, impulsive character. She doesn't always do the right thing, but I just love her. I loved the world building in this. I loved the fast pace of it. Like, even though it's a chunky book, there was always something to look forward to. There was always something going on. And it all just came to like the perfect ending ready for the third book. I am definitely aiming to finish this series by the end of the year. I just want it to be another 5-star because this was just incredible. Next up we have a horror novel by a new to me author, and that is Dead Girl Blues by David Sodergren. I can just tell that David Sodergren is going to be like an auto-read author for me now. In this book we're following a girl who is a dancer in a club, and one day she comes across this horrific scene and just goes looking for answers to all these questions that she has about what she saw and what is really going on. The writing style was so easy to read. It was campy, it was funny, there was some really good like gory bits in there. The ending was gut-wrenching. I was shocked, I was afraid, and I just thought, why have you done that? Why have you done that to me? But it was just perfect. Some of it felt a little bit cheesy almost, but in a good way, like almost a self-aware way. It just all worked, and I just loved the tone of it. The right amount of like dark and disturbing for me, and I honestly can't wait to read more of his books. The next one that I have is Reservoir 13 by John McGregor. This is unlike something that I thought I would love, but I just loved it so much. This is a very like slow, sleepy book about a small village in England in the aftermath of a girl's disappearance. So we basically follow the seasons over 13 years, I think it is, and it looks at people's relationships, but on a very like small scale, like not in depth, just like snippets of conversations. It'll talk about the animals and the nature in this village. I was just so hooked and in love with it. I could have read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more pages of this book. It was just the most like beautiful look at how life has to go on after these tragedies, and you might not have any answers for it, but things just have to keep moving, and things do keep moving. It just made me feel so peaceful, so like appreciative of the world. Can definitely see myself rereading this, and I think I read it in January when it was cold and everything's a bit slow and rubbish. Just what I needed at the time. So now we're on to my top 2. So the second favourite book that I have this year, I've already kind of mentioned, and it is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This one is so beautiful. It is a memoir style book, which is looking at one of the author's real relationships that she had with a woman which was abusive, and it kind of looks at this relationship in lots of different lenses and how she felt like she couldn't really talk about what was going on with her relationship because there's so much pressure and stigma attached to lesbian relationships in general that she didn't feel like she could like tarnish the image of that. It had so many incredible things to say. It was expertly written, such a clever like structure to it as well, and just a really interesting way to tell this like memoir story. And the last book for this video, I bet you're like, thank God for that, is A Short Stay in Hell by Stephen Peck. This is what reminds me that I love weird horror novellas. This one was just everything I wanted and more. So in this book we're basically following a very religious man who has just died. He very quickly learns that basically his religion was not the true religion, and any person who was not following that religion is in a version of hell. There are lots of different versions, but his specific version is a massive library with every book that could ever possibly have been written. His job is to find the book that tells his life story, and when he does, he can deposit it in this like Dropbox and go to heaven. And I know that that sounds a little bit silly, but trust me, this book gave me the most existential dread that I've felt for a long time. The way that it talked about the societies that were forming there, the friendships and the relationships that were forming there, just all felt very like human, very real, but I was just like instantly engaged, instantly hooked. And like I say, it gave me this like awful dread feeling of being in that situation, of being there. And I feel like the idea was so simple, but the way that he pulled it off was just like exactly what I wanted. I feel like if you like I Who Have Never Known Men, then you might like this one because it has a similar sort of feel to me anyway. So everybody, that is all the books that I've read this year from worst to best. I hope it's given you a bit more of an insight into what I've been reading this year, what I've been enjoying. Thank you for sticking around to the end of this video if you're still here. Give this video a like so that I can see that you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more videos from me, and I hope to see you in my next one. Bye!